So as a kid, whenever the circus came to town, I was there. I loved it. Circuses like that are now a thing of the past with elephants and animals like that because we're rightly more sensitive to the way animals were often mistreated and put on display for our amusement. We now know that's a bit, what's the word, unethical, cruel. But in a modern circus where they exist at all, only has human performers who are participating willingly, usually acrobats. And the style of the whole thing is quite a bit different and more modern. Have you ever seen a Cirque du Soleil show? Amazing. But as a child, it was the human performers who really got my attention anyway. The acrobats and the trapeze artists were impressive, but it was the tightrope walkers who amazed me the most and who sparked my imagination. There's something about watching someone step out onto a high wire, even someone you know is highly trained and who's practiced for hours every day, and watch them take that walk and defy death. Now, I've seen documentaries about high wire artists, and quite often it's a family thing that's passed down from one generation to the next. So, from a very early age, with a wire that's strung only a few inches off the ground in the backyard, you learn the basics of balance and movement and how to train every muscle in your body to respond instantly to the slightest shift in the tension of the wire or the flow of the air around you. And not until you can master the low wire is the wire then raised higher. And as you get better and more confident, the wire is raised even higher and then higher until by the time, let's say you're a teenager, you are ready to perform in public on a truly high wire. So no one steps out onto a high wire the very first time they walk a tightrope, just like no one takes their first driving lesson at a Formula One race, we would hope. That's not to say the reality of being dozens of feet up high off the ground without a net is not scary or obviously dangerous. It is. A fall could injure you severely or even kill you. And it's not that you don't think about that prospect, you do. It's just that you've conditioned your body, and mostly you've conditioned your mind, to take that walk anyway. Now, at first glance, the goal for tightrope walkers appears to be making it across the wire from one side safely to the other side. So, to that safety of the sturdy platform where you cannot fall, getting to that destination looks to the observer to be the whole point. But there's a famous quote by Carl Walenda. He was probably the best known high wire artist ever, and he said, "Being on a tightrope is living. Everything else is waiting." I love that because the whole process of learning to walk a tightrope throughout your life and the perspective of being on it, of constantly training and practicing and performing, being on the wire, navigating it, testing it, living it, as the whole point is a wonderful metaphor for what we experience in life. But that's only really true, I think, if we live a life of faith. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that kind of life is exclusive to Christian faith, but it certainly includes it. What I mean when I say faith is understanding that life is lived on a wire. And if you stay safely on a platform on either side, or you spend life safely on the ground, well, then you're only waiting. The thing about being on a tightrope and the thing about faith is that even if you have practice from childhood, starting out low and working your way up, there are still no guarantees about life. Carl Belinda died when he was 73 years old, falling from a wire that was strung between two 10-story buildings in Puerto Rico. One of the wires wasn't secured correctly, and it was very windy that day, but that's where his life was. That's where he was most alive, out there, on the wire. So does that mean faith can kill you? No, it just means that we all die someday, somehow. Faith is about how we live in the meantime. Now, the Apostle Paul tells us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. As an example, he describes how Abraham, that old biblical character who was unable to have children, how he continued to live by the faith that someday, somehow, he would be the father of a great nation. The story goes God had promised him that, and sure enough, eventually, Abraham and his wife Sarah do have children who go on to have children, and on, becoming the patriarchs and the matriarchs of the people of Israel. Now, the funny thing about Abraham's story, though, is that the vast bulk of it has nothing at all to do with him having any children. His life story takes up a huge chunk of the book of Genesis, and almost all of it is focused on his journey, his searching, his relationships, his life, his living. That's where Abraham's faith is lived out. Now, at first glance, you might say that Abraham's goal in life, the whole point of his life, is to have a child, but it's not. Abraham's life is not defined by having children, although there is that weird story about him almost sacrificing his son Isaac. But by that time, Abraham's life is almost played out. No, his life story is not about getting from point A to point B, making it from one side of the wire to the other. It's about what happens between point A and point B that matters. And that story is about his faith. And in that whole story, he is on a high wire constantly. It's pretty dramatic. Not knowing which way the wind's going to blow, or if the wire will break, but living fully on it anyway. Living with an assurance that his journey was guided by something he could only hope was real, but was still worth the risk. Life was out on the wire, not in the waiting. And because of that, Abraham was deemed faithful. And if faith, as Paul says, is to be convinced of things unseen, what does that mean? One of the odd things I've noticed about high wire artists is that they rarely, if ever, look down. Instead, they look straight ahead. Now, it's not that they have a fear of heights or suffer from vertigo, although they might have both. It's that they are intentionally not looking at the wire. Because what happens if you look at the wire? You lose your focus. You become unbalanced. There's a very similar phenomenon if you've ever practiced yoga and tried a pose called the Vrikshasana, or the tree pose. It's where you balance on one foot with your other foot resting on your calf or your thigh or sticking out somehow. It's practically impossible to do a tree pose, at least it is for me, if you're looking down at your foot that's planted on the ground and you're concerned about tumbling over. But it's relatively easy to do a tree pose if you do a couple things. First, you got to stop worrying about keeping your balance. But mostly, you find an object in the distance and you focus your gaze on that. That object is called a drishti. And it can be anything, just a tiny smudge on the wall in front of you, or a picture on the wall, or a book on a shelf. One time, I was in a yoga class, and I found a small dark spot on a distant wall, and I was all set. It was perfect. But then my drishti started moving. It was a bug climbing up the wall, so I fell over. But seriously, whether it's yoga or walking a tightrope, your focus is in front of you as you do your thing. You don't see the wire, you don't see the ground, it's unseen, and yet you're on it in that moment. You trust it's there holding you up, but you can't see it. Maybe Paul had something like that in mind in trying to describe the nature of faith. Maybe hope is like a drishti on a wall or an object in the distance ahead of you as you navigate the wire, something to help us keep our balance when the forces of life itself conspire to throw us off balance. I once thought of faith as a kind of commodity, as if the more faith I acquired, the more God would love me and accept me, the more protected I would be from sorrow and pain. The point of life, I was taught, was to have a big, strong faith account that could endure any problem, any tragedy, any disappointment. And at the end of my days, I would have so much faith stored up, I could easily afford that first-class airfare to eternal life. But I have to admit, in the meantime, I never found that to be true. Because just like all of us, I have had my share of failures, mistakes, and problems and sorrows, some self-inflicted, and some that just came out of nowhere. And no amount of faith I thought that I'd built up in my account made much of a difference in those moments. Every time, I was still thrown off balance. And I realized I was thinking about faith in the wrong way, at least for me. My mistake was understanding my relationship with God as some kind of a transactional thing. That if I only did thus and such, then God would reciprocate in kind. But that is not what Paul is getting at. And I no longer understand God as being separate from me, requiring me to prove myself to earn acceptance and love, or requiring me to recite creeds or to believe certain doctrines to prove how faithful I am and to build up my faith account. Now, faith, I've discovered, is not a goal. It's not a bragging right. It's just the nature of the relationship of trusting in something I cannot see, but I hope is there, holding my hand invisibly in the midst of my living. And holding me close, quite literally, in the loving relationships that I discover on my journey. That is where I find God. In you, with you, together, all of us, living into the unseen, but living abundantly, not waiting there on the safe platform, but walking out onto the tightrope of life together, keeping our balance as best we can, holding each other's hands, and with our eyes and hearts clearly focused ahead, focused on love.